welcome. How's everybody doing? That's good. My name's Bryan Burrough, and for more years than I care to count, I've had the good fortune to be able to work for Vanity Fair writing about rich people and bad people, and my specialty, rich bad people. And I think that's why they've asked me to talk with this gentleman today. I don't know when I first noticed a certain phenomena around Manhattan, probably in the 80s when I began reading a magazine called Spy, about the first naming of the really glamorous and important people. I think the first one I remember was the Donald, and then there was Harvey. At some point there was Graydon and Anna and others, and now there's Preet. Preet Bharara is the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and it is a measure of his renown, or perhaps notoriety in some quarters, that he has ascended to first name basis in the city.
That's mostly because nobody knows how to pronounce my last name. But
well, that might be. Having gotten to know you a little bit better during the process leading up this, I can tell you that you are somewhat less scary in person.
Thank you, I think. It's great to be here with all these cool people. Warren Buffett was in the audience before. I hope you do get that raise. If I can do something to help you, let me know. I was kind of wondering why it was that I would be invited to something like this, and it occurs to me that maybe there's a part of Graydon's mind thinking that I would cause someone to be arrested and add to some drama of the event, but we'll see about that.
One of the themes that we've heard from the woman at SpaceX through the last panel has been kind of how backward government is, and General Alexander addressed a little bit of this, but I know you have some opinions on it as well. And you know, when I come out here, I feel like, and I think maybe you feel somewhat the same. It's like people, you know, we're coming from the old world to the new world. Is government back in the old world really as backward as it sometimes seems? I mean, there are people, I think, who seriously believe you guys write your subpoenas on Apple IIs and Lisas.
Yeah, Commodore VIC-20, actually. Look, I think there are lots of parts of government that are a little bit backward, and in particular, and it comes out when you come out to Northern California and to Silicon Valley, particularly when it comes to technology. We do the best we can in our office in Manhattan to embrace technology, I think. But just to give the audience here some sense of how backward and how conservative and resistant to change government is, and particularly the part of government that I work in, the Justice Department, up until just a few months ago, we were using a program called WordPerfect. Yeah, that's a huge laugh getter. We also are among the only people left who use this thing. You might have only seen a fossilized version of it, a BlackBerry. When we first started talking in our office about how to get the message out about some of the cases we were doing and some of the deterrent message, which is very important, and we talked about a thing called Twitter, and this is only a year or two ago. The people in my office who were fairly young, so it's not always about age, didn't understand why we would do that. And I said, well, there are conservative organizations who understand that you get your message out through Twitter. One of them, I believe, is the Catholic Church and the Pope. So when you're talking about people in government, particularly prosecutors who are very conservative in a particular way, they're even more conservative than the Catholic Church, it seems. And so there's a little bit of a turnaround that you have to do, and I think that everybody, it was great to hear the panel earlier with Senator Rand Paul talking about how important it is for there to be innovators, not just in the private sector, but also in government, because government may need it more badly than anyone else.
Yeah, you know you're in trouble when the Pope is more modern on some of these things than you are.
Yeah, we're working on it.
Well, I'm prepared to believe that you guys are going to be moving beyond what we could call the WordPerfect stage. I think it probably of most use in talking to a crowd out here, though, is what they could learn that you guys do well. And what you guys do well is prosecute the bad guys. As you've done, well, pretty incredibly over the last few years. As you look at the corporations and the corporate situations that you've entered and prosecuted successfully, are there commonalities? Are there things that, other than people doing bad things, but in terms of the corporate culture, I read a couple of years ago an interview where you actually felt or used the words that there was a culture of corruption on Wall Street. And I, as many bad guys as I've written about, kind of found myself going, really? Is there something in common out there? Is there something in the water?
Yeah, which is not to say that it's everywhere, and not to say that every company on Wall Street or every company that makes products has this problem, but there are places where I say there are pockets of corruption that develop. And after doing it for about 5+ years, you begin to see patterns in conduct and behavior that relate to the culture of certain kinds of institutions. And by the way, it's not just companies and private sector firms and Wall Street firms. It's also sometimes at a university. It's also sometimes at a government agency. We do a lot of public corruption work also, where we talk about a culture of corruption. And one of the problems is you sometimes have people who are trying to figure out a way to get as close to the legal line as possible without going over, so they can maximize short-term profit while leaving at risk the long-term viability and sustainability of the firm. And you see that over and over and over again. And when people are trying to get as close to the line as possible without going over, some people are going to miss the mark, and they're going to go over the line. And what that causes is it causes regulators and prosecutors like those in my office and in other offices to take a look, just like firefighters have to go look when there's smoke. There may not be a fire, but if there's smoke, you got to look. And sometimes when you look to see if there's a fire, when there's smoke, you have to break down a door or break a window, and people suffer when that happens. And part of the reason for that is you have places where people are trying to be as cute as possible, whether it's talking about a tax shelter or it's talking about what kind of inside information you can gather and trade on, or how to cheat the accounting rules. It happens all the time. And I like to talk to business groups and to business students about how if you have a culture of getting as close to the line as possible, where your entire understanding of the firm is that you aspire to the bare minimum of what the law requires, you're going to get into trouble. And I think that's a major problem. There are others also. I think there are a lot of cultural problems.
When you encounter cultural problems like this, is it almost always necessarily a failure of leadership?
I think almost always, yeah, because look, whether you're talking about a failure of personnel and you're saying that part of the reason things went awry at this firm or at that place, it's because you had a few bad apples. Well, somebody had to have a system in place where those bad apples were hired. I mean, we had a case against a large hedge fund that maybe people know about, SAC Capital, and we actually charged the hedge fund. And one of, I think, the most resonant things in that indictment was a discussion of how a person was being hired to come into the hedge fund who had a reputation for being an insider trader at another firm. And the compliance folks and the general counsel folks said, don't hire this person. And they were overruled, and that person was hired. And then, shockingly, as the indictment lays out, and as the guilty plea made clear, he started engaging in insider trading within moments. That, to me, is a failure of leadership at the top, and that happens over and over and over again. People come in, and they ask sometimes for leniency. They say, well, you know what? It was a few people who were doing bad things, and we have this great 200-page, small font, double-sided compliance program. And those of you who are in the tech industry or any other company, you have lawyers who tell you about these things. And I often ask a simple question, which is, it's great that you have this compliance program, but in trying to get to answer the question of whether or not that is just window dressing to use at meetings like this, if the stuff hits the fan, or if it was part of what the culture of the firm was about, I ask, could you give me examples of times that the head of the firm, himself or herself, said something about how it was important that they do things lawfully and legally, and whether or not when people were welcomed into the firm at the top, all the way at the top, people said, we have all these rules, we have all these regulations. The bottom line is, the simplest bottom line is, if you lie, if you cheat, if you steal, that's not tolerated here. And if you do that, I don't care how much money you're making for us, you're going to be sent out on the street. And it's remarkable to me how often that doesn't happen. Obviously, you need to have rules, just like the United States has to have laws. You have a whole body of laws. But if you don't have a constitution, I think, as a country, you might be a little bit adrift. And companies also, I think, maybe it's odd for a guy like me to be saying this because we believe in the rule of law and we're very rule-oriented. But I think an over-focus on the minutia of rules that regulators, who are not always right, that regulators prescribe without thinking about the big picture of making sure that everyone understands that they're supposed to behave well, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because if you don't, that's adding an enormous amount of risk to the books. I mean, there are companies that go out of business when they get investigated or prosecuted by us.
That certainly deals with the question of leadership as far as operating leadership go. We've probably got some people here who sit on boards, report to corporate boards. What is the message that a board should be putting? I mean, you mentioned this story about the guy at the stock exchange who asked you about how much time boards should be worrying about legal and regulatory.
It seems to me when you're on the board of directors or in the C-suite somewhere, that you have to be worried about all things that affect the firm and the profitability of the firm and the sustainability of the firm and the risks to those things. And one of those risks is competition. Another one of those risks is regulatory or prosecution risk, I suppose. But oddly to me, very, very smart people, some of whom are maybe as smart as folks who are attending this conference, put those kinds of concerns in this other box and this other silo. And so the anecdote I was telling you earlier about somebody who asked me a question at the stock exchange who represents boards on a regular basis said, Mr. Bharara, given your experience, what percentage of time do you think a board should spend on compliance issues or regulatory issues? And I thought it was a preposterous question because it depends, like so many things in life and on board memberships. If you're a company that has been indicted or had the threat of indictment and has been the subject of regulatory proceedings multiple times and 9 folks have been hauled off to jail, my sense is you should be spending a lot of time on those kinds of issues. On the other hand, if you have a good reputation and there has never been an action taken against you and you think you have a good culture and the tone at the top is good, then you can spend relatively less time. The reason it's shocking to me is I don't think anybody here would think it would be a wise question to ask somebody, what percentage of time do you think, as a general matter, that boards or executives should be spending thinking about their competition or about innovation or about creativity? Because it depends. If you are a company, not to pull out my BlackBerry again, but if you're a company that has a threat of competition and is not innovating quickly, then you'd be spending a lot of time on that. And I don't quite know why it is that when we get to this area that is of some interest to me and the people in my office, that it is not thought about in the same way.
Yeah. Even though we're sitting in Silicon Valley, we are talking about policing Wall Street. And I've been on the street on and off in one guise or another since 1983. And I've never understood why there seem to be so damn many more crooks in this business than in almost any other business I've ever been exposed to. You just do not see the police in Los Altos pulling out, Xerox repairmen out of their offices in handcuffs like you do and your predecessors have done over the years. Is there something about the prevalence of money in financial services that makes it more prone to criminality?
Yeah, that could be. It's a dangerous business to try to get inside people's heads and figure out why it is they commit crimes. Some of them do it, after they already have a lot of money. And you would think, intuitively, you would think if you already have $1 billion, maybe you should call it quits on the cheating and the fraud. And we have sent to prison people who had hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank, and then it's a complicated psychology, I guess. You have proximity to money, and as someone wrote recently, it's not about accumulating a certain amount of money. It's about, in the bizarre sense, maybe this person speculates keeping up with the Joneses. So, to one person, you got $100 million. It seems like, and I'd be happy with $80. But that person is maybe associating with people who he thinks are dumber and less talented and work less hard, and they have billions, and they want to sort of graduate into that circle, and maybe that's why that sometimes happens. But I think anytime you have proximity to power and money in many ways gives you access to power, you're going to have people who are going to cut corners and are going to do bad things.
That would seem to be the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you think there's an element of peer pressure there too. It's the House in the Hamptons syndrome?
From what I can tell, we're not in the business of diagnosing people's mentality on these things, but yeah, a little bit, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. These people who have gone to some of the best business schools and the best educations, have the biggest houses, have more money than you could ever spend in a lifetime, are then putting all that at risk to make another $2, $3, $4 million in some of these insider trading cases. We had that. Now some people are just, nuts or evil, as the judge who sentenced Bernard Madoff, who was a defendant in a case out of my office, called him evil and sentenced him to 150 years in prison. That may be more of a pathological thing than some of these other cases where people are trying to make a little bit of a quick buck, because that lasted over decades and decades.
We always talk about the mentality of the bad guys. but I've also heard you speak with an element of personal fascination in the prevalence of people who are the victims in cases like Madoff. Are you still surprised? I mean, I was at just how prone people were to believe the most outlandish promises. Is there a psychology there that's unique to Wall Street or financial services or capitalism?
The dynamic in some of these fraud cases is really interesting because you can sort of understand, I guess, how somebody defrauds a vulnerable person who's not very educated, through some kind of fraud. But in a lot of these cases, like the Madoff case, and we prosecuted a gentleman by the name of Ken Starr, not that Ken Starr, a different Ken Starr, who was the broker to the stars, to multimillionaires, to famous people that you would know, and they were all taken in those cases because the person who was perpetrating the fraud took on an aura that they expected that person to take on. So if you play the part, I've found over and over again, and you drive the Bentley like you should be driving the Bentley, and you have access to a lot of people, and you get your picture taken with the President of the United States, people will believe you have all this money. We prosecuted a guy once who was very well educated and had a patrician air about him, and he had gotten all these loans from banks to the tune of $160 or $70 million, and it was all nonsense. And when he was approached by the FBI for the purposes of questioning him and then potentially arresting him, he said, "It's all a big misunderstanding. I do have the collateral to back up the $180 million. And the next morning, the money was actually put back in the bank. We thought for a moment maybe we'd gotten this wrong, and found out that next morning, again, given the aura that he had about himself and the people who he could point to as people who would vouch for him, he defrauded another bank of $180 million to put it in the first bank. And now he's doing 11 years in prison for the combined fraud. And he was not defrauding, uneducated people who don't understand finance. It's amazing to me how much people are prepared to believe if you play the part. And so the lesson of all those cases is, it doesn't matter how smart you think someone is and how many other of your friends have trusted someone, you should trust and verify for yourself.
Back in the day, your office seemed to be 80% of the press releases coming out of your office were insider trading, not necessarily your predecessors.
That's actually not true. I think 80%, those were the ones that the press bothered to cover.
Well, it seemed like 80%, I was going to say, were insider traders and mafia guys. And now every fourth story on the front page of the Wall Street Journal is some new investigation of a large commercial bank. And it just seems to go on and on. Now we've got this LIBOR thing. At some point, can't you just leave that poor Jamie Dimon alone? I mean, what is it about banks that seem to be soaking up so much investigative resources?
I just want to quibble a bit with the premise of your question. The degree to which certain things out of my office or other prosecutors' offices that is reported bears very little resemblance to the number of person hours that are spent on various cases in the office. I mean, we've got a handful of people working on bank cases, a handful of people working on insider trading cases, a handful of people working on gang cases, which you never read. And if they're media folks here, this is a minor quibble I have, and I understand that you have to have readership. Nobody's going to read every day about how we're making the streets safe in Newburgh, New York, or in the Bronx, when people have to worry about how they go to school and whether or not their kid is going to get shot in the head by errant gang fire. And we do just as many cases and spend just as much time, in fact more, on that than we do on the cases that the financial press deems to be, very sexy in some way. Getting your issue about the banks, I think you have a culture problem at some of these banks, and every once in a while someone says, "Well, aren't you piling on?" And I say, "Well, why don't you talk to the bank that has multiple investigations that have opened legitimately, where multiple people have been arrested?" And you mentioned a bank a moment ago. And there have been a number of events that occurred with respect to that bank. In fact, they entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with respect to how they dealt with the Madoff money, and paid over $1 billion to go back to the Madoff victims. I think that the banks really have to ask themselves the question: are they behaving properly? Are they paying attention to the right things? Are they incentivizing people in the right way? I mean, we had a case. Imagine, what do you think the result would be if you changed the way you approve loans such that the quality control people one day are getting paid for how many loans that they process without reference to how many they approve, and the next day you start paying them an extra amount of money based on how many they approve? Well, you know what? Human nature tells you a lot more are going to get approved whether or not they deserve to be. And that you find over and over again. And I do think, it's not to say that everybody is bad and everyone is engaging in criminal conduct, but institutions, particularly large institutions like that, have to start asking themselves questions while the scrutiny is hot. Should we be continuing to do things the way we do them, or should we be making a sharp turn in a different direction?
Along similar lines, there's a question that I get asked, I was asked a lot in the weeks leading up to this, that I suspect you are awful tired of talking about, but this is a new audience, so I'll ask it again. You have done such amazing things on insider trading, and yet there are people who are always going to hop up and down saying, where are the indictments of the big CEOs who brought down Lehman, who brought down Bear Stearns, who caused the recession? Isn't this the moral equivalent of prosecuting a bunch of squeegee men while mass murderers are going free on 43rd Street?
Yeah, I will say, and I don't think I've ever spoken anywhere without getting that question. Thanks for keeping the streak alive. I should also say, by the way, it's very, during that time when the so-called squeegee men of the financial world were being prosecuted, we also put in jail for life multiple terrorists. We put in jail multiple people who have committed significant murders, all sorts of other cases that don't get covered enough. It's not an either-or situation. You have people working on all the things that are important to work about. You ask a question that deals with a lot of different financial institutions and a lot of different things. So there's no one answer to the question. Sometimes it's the case that there was actually no criminality. People were reckless and stupid and idiotic and gross in profit-taking. Sometimes it's the case that maybe there was criminality, but there was an impossibility of being able to get someone on the inside who could tell you what that information was, whether or not you had someone who was on a wiretap or an undercover who was wearing a body wire, or you have documents, or you have somebody who flipped on someone else, and sometimes the evidence is lacking. Sometimes it's also the case that people have good legal defenses to things because they've gotten lawyers to bless the representations they've made in transactions. So there are a lot of reasons why there might not be any particular case that has been brought. What I think people should understand is that I and the people in my office and everyone else who's a prosecutor in America, and there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds who have been responsible for looking at potential cases in this area, before they're prosecutors, they're Americans, and they're citizens of states, and they also have retirement plans, and they also suffered during the financial crisis. So, it is not a failure of will to the extent there are not certain cases that have been made, and people are still working on some of those cases. It's because there was a lack of evidence, or too much of a defense, or there wasn't a crime. And we understand as much as anyone, maybe even more, because it's our job, if crimes have been committed, to hold them accountable, and also because we live in the country and suffered just as much, if not more, from the financial crisis, that it's a frustrating thing to see bad things happen and not see a parade of people going to prison. But the legal system in this country is such that the burden and the standard is incredibly high, and it should be. Unless you start changing the standard in a way that I don't think people would love, where you take away criminal intent, or you don't have to have a unanimous jury, or you don't have to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It only has to be a preponderance of the evidence. You could do all those things. And I sometimes get into debates with people about this. And then you would see more people in jail. But you wouldn't only see CEOs in jail, you would also see people who made a mistake on their taxes in jail. If you begin to change what the requirements are, you don't pick and choose the brand of person that you imprison and separate from his or her liberty for long periods of time, just because one person works at a bank and another person was a teller somewhere. Those standards apply to everyone. And I know that's never a fully satisfactory answer for people, but I hope that people appreciate that a lot of energy and time, and much more than has been spent on some of these other cases you're talking about, on figuring out if there are ways to hold people accountable. And now we have brought some of those cases, criminal cases, and we brought a lot of civil cases, which can cause people to engage in reform and to change the way they do business. But I hear you, and that's a partial explanation.
Well, in your defense, I think what people just don't point out very often is when things go wrong like this, there is almost an assumption, I think, in some aspects of the public and certainly the press, that there must have been a crime committed. The fact is, incompetence causes far more things to go wrong in business, in my experience, than crime. And, we don't criminalize incompetence. We don't send stupid people, even stupid CEOs and stupid boards, to jail because their companies win it. We sue them to death.
Yeah, and
Having said that, do you find it personally frustrating as the U.S. Attorney that you haven't been able to make the big headline case that so many people seem to be wanting?
Well, first of all, it's not about headlines. It's about, I think you feel frustration anytime there's a particular case, a little bit, if you're a human being, where you think that someone has done bad things that were of a criminal nature and you can't hold them accountable. I mean, the whole business is to hold people accountable. Now, sometimes it's also the case that bad things happened at an institution and people say, well, why isn't the top guy in handcuffs and in chains? And often it's the case because the top person never wrote an email or never said to somebody in a recorded way, or you have no witness to say that they approved the particular transaction, or that there may have been. That's why I spent a lot of time talking about culture, because it's not really in the prosecutor's wheelhouse. But I do believe whether or not you can put someone in prison and prove beyond a reasonable doubt to a unanimous American jury that a crime was committed such that you should go to jail, I still believe that lots of terrible things happen and lots of bad cultures exist. And there was a culture of taking profits quickly and not caring about the quality of loans, and everyone else is doing it, so hey, what the hell, why don't I do it too? That was definitely happening. And part of the solution, in addition to holding people accountable criminally when you can, part of the solution is to have people understand that if you continue to have these terrible cultures where you don't give a damn about how you're doing business, you're going to have this happen again.
We have run over just a little bit, so I'd love to pull up the lights and ask people if they have any questions. We've got the microphones right here to your left and your right. Yes, ma'am.
Preet, thank you so much for being here today. The recent resignation of Eric Holder has left the world speculating on his successor. Many media outlets and bloggers list you as the favorite. I'm really curious about your thoughts on these rumors.
So I told my mom to stop planting questions in the audience. But she's very proud of me. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. George Roche from UC Berkeley Business School. So I totally agree about that cultural issue, right? And given the actions of Carmen Segura recently at the New York Fed, what are some mechanisms that you take to proactively prevent that culture bleeding into the Attorney General's office? And how can that be used and exported into other parts of the government?
I mean, I'm not going to talk about that particular instance that you mentioned, and it's not fully our business to change culture, but we do have some. I'll give you an example of another cultural problem that I think is very significant that I get a chance to mention, and that is in too many places there's a culture of there's not a culture in which people are comfortable when they see bad things happen, come forward and say something about it, and that's a gigantic issue, I think. When I go to business schools or I speak to groups like this, I will say that it's not really a scared straight program for white-collar crime, although it is a little bit, that I'm directing my words to the ears not just of the 2 or 3 people who, statistically speaking, in this room are expected to commit serious securities fraud, although I know who you are, and you will be followed. But it's to direct my words to the ears of the vast majority of people, whether it's in this room or at a hedge fund or at a university or at a sports league, who are good and are full of integrity and want to do the right thing and want the world to be better and want profits to be made in a legitimate and honorable and legal way. The problem is that that doesn't happen. And so all these, some of these gigantic cases that are associated with my office and that you know about in the country, throughout the country, bad things like the Galleon hedge fund case or Madoff or the things that happened at Penn State or the issues with prescription drugs in certain sports leagues, there were good people who knew about those things throughout those institutions, and they didn't do a damn thing about it. And it's hard, because you don't want to come out and be ostracized and be thought of as a troublemaker. So one of the most important things we do is try to expose examples where a company went astray because that company didn't investigate things enough. We had one where there was a $500 million fraud, and we made the company admit openly to facts that made clear that had they investigated a whistleblower's complaint some years earlier, the fraud would have been capped at $70 million before it got to $500 million. So you need a culture, and by speaking about it and by making people admit things, a culture where people feel comfortable when they see bad things happening over there, they're going to go report it over here, but not just that, also a culture in which the leaders of the company or the institution, any institution, take seriously those complaints, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how loud you blow the whistle if the referees are wearing earplugs. And so you need both of those things to happen. And a lot of pain, based on my own experience in the office, a lot of pain in a lot of places would have been saved if you had a better culture of people appreciating that they could come forward, and if they did come forward, someone would do something about it.
Let me throw you one last one and get out there on this, perhaps. We're talking about all the really important stuff, right? The stuff that you're supposed to say because you're, the U.S. attorney and all that. We've told students all the good stuff, the right stuff. We've told people the good, how to handle their boards and everything. Can I ask you just like the fun question I've always wanted to know?
I'm scared to know what I'm scared.
No. What's left of the mafia?
Oh. I think there are probably fewer than 2 or 3 people here who are in the mob. Look, the mob is still a very serious force. Not in the same way that it was before. Some members of the mob are going after, are doing white-collar crimes because it's more lucrative and you spend potentially less time in jail. But the 5 families are still there, and
all 5.
Yeah, the 5 families are still around. They're still extorting businesses. They're still using baseball bats. I mean, the Attorney General and a couple of other U.S. attorneys came to New York only, I think, 2 years ago, and we had the largest takedown in a mob prosecution that we had ever had. I think 130 people arrested all at the same time. The mob, by the way, you're talking about, I assume you're talking about La Cosa Nostra, the so-called Italian mafia, but there are other kinds of organized crime threats that happen also. You have
the movies about them are not nearly as good.
There's some Russian organized crime good movies, I think. I'll send you a couple. But is it at the same level that it was at in the 80s? Probably not, but it's still, an incredibly vibrant, series of criminal syndicates that make the lives of the people who they decide to extort and cheat and defraud and intimidate and bully and sometimes kill miserable. So I think they're still out there.
Well, thank you. Do you have any other questions? If not, thank you for your time. I guess we're headed into a break. And thank you.